So welcome everybody to Data Protection and Inventories. I'm delighted to say that we've got Rob Cole and Jessy Jarvis with us today from the Information Commissioner's Office. This is something that we should all definitely be aware of if we're in business, if we have any data whatsoever that we process or store, whether it's on computers or in paper form. We need to know about this sort of stuff. So I'm delighted to have these guys along, and I'm absolutely delighted that you've all joined us here today. Okay, so just quickly moving on then, a little bit of housekeeping. So we are recording the presentation. We will be releasing this later on. We'll be putting it on our YouTube channel, and you will get a link to that. The guys have kindly said we can distribute the slide deck to you, so you'll get a chance to review that at your leisure. And please do add any questions to the chat panel. Now, I'm in a luxurious position today because I've got two co-presenters. So while one is talking, the other can be answering questions. But we will also add some, if we've got time at the end, to have a discussion about certain particular areas. So please don't be shy. Put your questions in there. Otherwise, I will use the chairman's prerogative and I will ask my questions. And they're probably not as good as yours, I don't think. And just a final point there. I think everyone should be on mute, but if you're not on mute, please put your mics on mute, just in case there's any interruptions. Okay, well, without further ado then, let me hand over to Jessy, who's hopefully going to share a slideshow there.
Brilliant, I'll just do that now.
There we go. Yeah, we can see that. Thank you.
Excellent, brilliant. Thanks, Jessy. Everybody can see that, yeah. Okay, thanks, Stuart. And welcome everyone to our data protection session today. And as I say, thanks, Stuart, for inviting us along to do this presentation. Today we'll be talking about the basics of data protection and what you need to know and do to comply with the law. So we'll be giving you a brief overview, including the backbone of the legislation, which is the principles, and also some key terms and concepts, and hopefully enough information to help you understand what your responsibilities in terms of the law may be in your line of work. That's our aim at the end of this session, hopefully. And as much as I love talking about data protection, and I have worked in data protection for over 20 years, so I should love it by now, even I admit it can be a bit of a dry subject. So we've tried to use practical examples drawn from the many questions we get asked every day in our department and try to steer them towards your kind of work where we can, to illustrate some of the points that we'll be talking through. So hopefully that should make it a little bit less dry. Before we go any further, let's introduce ourselves properly. So I'll go first. My name is Rob Cole. We're both from the Information Commissioner's Office, or ICO for short. And as I say, I've worked at the ICO for about 23 years now, I think, mostly as a manager in customer-facing roles, but also in our investigations and regulatory departments too. I'm currently a Senior Engagement and Policy Officer in our Business Advice Services, or BAS for short. You'll tell through this presentation we love an acronym at the ICO. And as the name Business Advice would suggest, our team's role is to provide legislative advice to organisations of all types and sizes. And in particular, my role within the team at the moment is to make sure our staff have the knowledge and skills to do that, and also to help our team pass that knowledge on to organisations like yours by doing presentations like this. So, Jessy?
Yeah, so hi, my name's Jessy, and I've been a case officer in BAS for just over a year now. I previously worked in the education sector, so it's very different than what I did before. As Rob previously mentioned there, in BAS we act as the point of contact for organisations, providing live services through our helpline and live chat, and also providing written guidance through casework that people have contacted us via the website with. So let's get started on this presentation properly. So today we're going to have a look at who the ICO are, what we do and why we're here. Then I'm going to talk you through some basic data protection terms. So what is personal data, data subjects, data controllers, what is processing and what are processes. We're then going to look at core data protection principles, and we're going to focus on lawfulness, fairness and transparency. Then we're going to have a look at a couple of practical issues. So I'll cover lawful basis, data sharing and data retention. And don't worry, I'll explain what they all are as we go through as well. I'll then pass over to Rob, and he's going to cover individuals' rights when it comes to data protection. He'll also cover personal data breaches, explain what they are and what to do if you experience one. He'll then cover the legal requirement to pay the data protection fee, and he'll briefly also touch on any new developments to be aware of. If you have any questions, as Stuart said before, you can put them in the chat. If we can answer them going through, we will, but if not, we'll try and get to them at the end. If there's any problems putting questions in the chat, you can always ask us at the end as well. Okay, so the ICO, as Rob said, we're the Information Commissioner's Office and we're the UK's independent regulator for data protection. So it's our job to uphold information rights, including data protection and freedom of information laws. So we support organisations of all sizes to comply with the data protection law. And our teams do that through providing practical advice and managing personal data breach reports. And we also have a website which covers a lot of the guidance and includes a really useful section on small to medium businesses. And that's likely to apply to most of you. So it'd be great if you wanted to have a look at that. It's a really helpful section. Everything's in nice plain language. It's quite easy to understand. So if, later on today, if you wanted to hop on our website and have a look, that'd be great. And our aim today, as Rob said, is to give you some clear, common sense guidance that you can use going forward. So let's clarify some key terms. So the first one we've got is personal data. So personal data can be pretty much anything that identifies a living individual. So their name or their date of birth would be some obvious examples. But even if you don't know somebody's name, you could still be using their personal data. So for example, if you were referring to someone as the old man that lived at number 22 Chestnut Street and he drives a Ford Mondeo, then that could make them identifiable. So it could potentially be their personal data. And I think it's really important to note for what you do that there is a difference between information about a property versus information about an individual. So if you just had an address and details about a property, so say for example there's a dent in the bottom left hand side of the front door, then that wouldn't be someone's personal data because it's just about the property. However, if you then use those details to determine something about the occupants, so for example Mr. Smith isn't going to get his deposit back because of the dent in the door, then it becomes his personal data. And it's also important to point out that the UK GDPR does apply to the personal data of sole traders. So in your role, you might interact with landlords who are sole traders and you might collect or process some of their personal data about them for things like invoices. So the next sort of really common term you'll come across is data subject. And that is just simply the term we use for the individual whose data is being processed. So the data subject, and it's their personal data. And another thing is processing. So if you look at our website and things like that, you'll come across this term a lot. And processing just refers to anything that you do with personal data. So whether it's just collecting it, storing it, sharing it, anything like that, all counts as processing. Then we've got data controller. So the data controller is the main decision maker who decides how and why personal data is used. They can be an organisation of any size, including sole traders, charities, associations. It's any business that processes personal data. So when we're talking about data controllers, we're talking about the legal entity that controls the data, so the business or the organisation, rather than the employee of that business. And then we've got a data processor. So they act on controllers' instructions, so they only process data as directed. So the processor makes no decisions on what should happen to the data, and they only use it for the purpose instructed by the controller. So for example, an organisation might use another company to send out their mail or to manage their payroll, and that company would be the processor. So in your role, if you work entirely for a housing association or a landlord and you don't decide on how any data is used, then you're likely to be a data processor. However, you might also be a data controller for some of the information. So I mentioned before that some landlords might be sole traders. So if you're collecting personal information about them, so you can send them an invoice, then you would be the data controller for that information that you process about them. Similarly, if you have any employees, then you'll be the data controller for any information you hold about them. Regardless of whether you are a data controller or a data processor, all parties are responsible for complying with data protection law, but it is the data controllers who usually shoulder the highest level of responsibility. And although we mentioned that the controller acts as the main decision maker in relation to personal data, you can actually have situations where there are joint controllers for the same information, so they would equally share responsibility and authority for that information. And one last thing to mention while we're talking about controllers and processors is that where you have a controller processor relationship, you need to have a contract in place before processing begins. So the contract outlines what can and can't be done with the data and who so it should cover what data is used, the purpose of the processing, how long the data will be processed for, any security measures that need to be in place to keep that data safe, and what happens when there's a data breach or an individual makes a request about one of their rights. So moving on then, and I can see that we've got some questions coming through on the chat, which is great. We're going to look at the principles. So there are 7 data protection principles, and following these are vital to getting data protection right. They apply regardless of whether you're a processor or a controller, and they're the foundation of the UK GDPR and feature right at the start of the legislation. So all of the legislation actually revolves around these core principles. So compliance with the spirit of these principles is fundamental for good data protection practice. And when we're talking about compliance with data protection law, we're really talking about compliance with these principles. So these principles are lawfulness, fairness and transparency, and I'll actually circle back to that one in a minute because it's sort of the key fundamental one and that I'll go into in more detail. Then you've got purpose limitation, so you should only use data for the reason that you've collected it. An example of this would be only using tenants' contact details to arrange an inspection, and then you shouldn't then use them for a completely unrelated reason. So I don't know, if you had like a side hustle where you sold products through Etsy or something, you shouldn't then be contacting them to try and sell your products. Data minimization is only collecting the information that you need. So again, you might need the contact details of tenant, but you probably wouldn't need things like their date of birth or their eye colour. Then we've got accuracy. So you need your records are accurate and up to date. So for example, if a landlord moved house or changed their email address, you should update your records once they've let you know that there's been a change. Next, we've got storage limitation. So you should only keep personal data for as long as you need it. And then when you no longer need it, the data should be deleted, or if it's a physical copy, it needs to be physically destroyed. Then we've got integrity and confidentiality, and this one's also known as the security principle. And it's about keeping data secure. So it could be anything from not leaving documents lying around to having a secure password for your laptop, and making sure that you've got the latest security updates on your devices. And then last of all, we've got accountability. So that just means taking responsibility for your data handling. So this principle is underpinned by the other 6. So if you get those right, it will help you with your accountability. And just bear with me one second. So I said I was going to focus in on lawfulness, fairness and transparency, which is the first data protection principle. And this one's crucial to getting personal data processing right and doing it compliantly. So when you are a controller, you must be clear and honest about what you do with people's data. So when you're collecting data, you need to tell people what you're collecting, why you're collecting it, what you'll do with it, who you'll share it with, and how long you'll keep it for. And the best way to do this is normally through a privacy notice. And it's best to decide what you'll do with data and tell people right at the very start. So providing this information makes sure people know what to expect. And the clearer you are about your use of data, the more people will trust your organisation. So examples of where you might need a privacy notice would be if you work for a landlord who is a sole trader and you need to process that information for invoicing purposes, or again, like I said before, if you've got staff who you employ, so they understand what data you collect and about them and how it is used. Okay, so moving on slightly, we're going to look at lawful basis. So as part of the principles, you must have a lawful basis for processing personal data. And we know that this is quite a difficult concept for people to get their heads around, and we do get a lot of questions about it. But basically, the legislation looks at all of the reasons that controllers use personal data, and it groups them into 6 categories. So in essence, the lawful basis is the reason that you're allowed to process people's personal data. And there are 6 different lawful bases. The first one is consent, which is where you get permission from someone to process their personal data. There are times, though, when this might not be the best basis to use, because if people remove their consent, then you'd have to stop processing. So although this isn't in your sector, a common example that we use is that a school, if they use consent to take photos of pupils, say for example to use in a brochure or something like that, and then the child withdraws their consent, then the school would have to stop using that brochure and try and sort of collect it back in, and that could be a waste of money and it could cause some practical issues as well. I suppose the same might apply for you. If you are taking photos in a property and you've asked some of the tenants to pose in the photos, and you've asked for their consent to be able to take photos of them, obviously if they then turn around and go, actually, I don't want you to use those photos anymore, then you would have to remove them. We know that consent is sort of the most common lawful basis that people think about, and they use it all the time, but it's not the only one that you can rely on, and I'll talk through some of the others now. So when you're sort of thinking about your lawful basis, just bear in mind that consent might not be the most appropriate one. So the next one we've got is contract, and that's where you have a contract in place with someone and you need to process personal data about them to be able to fulfill that contract. So I keep bringing it up, but again, the most obvious example would be if you have a contract in place with a landlord who is a sole trader, that would be your, like, the contract would be the lawful basis that you need for any personal details that you process about them. The next one we've got is legal obligation. So that's when you're required by law to process personal information. So for example, a bank is legally required to process certain personal data about people in order to run anti-money laundering checks before they can provide that person with certain services. And if you had employees, then there would be certain information you'd need to provide to HMRC to comply with your legal obligations as an employer. Next, we've got vital interest. So this one's only appropriate if you need to share or use someone's personal data in order to save their life. So the most obvious example of this would be giving information to an ambulance crew who's helping someone that's unconscious. You know, if you knew who they were and you could give them that information, then that's when vital interest would be your lawful basis. The next one we've got is public task. So that is used by public authorities and organisations that are carrying out specific tasks in the public interest. So this lawful basis might be appropriate if you work on behalf of a public authority, such as a local council. And then lastly, we have got legitimate interest. So that's when you're using personal information that is in the legitimate interest of yourself, an individual, or a third party. So this lawful basis is most likely to be appropriate when you're using personal information that people would reasonably expect you to use and that the impact on their privacy would be minimal. So an example of this would be if you hold contact details for an employee's next of kin because it's in your employee's best interest or in their legitimate interest for you to let someone know if they're taken ill while they're at work. So as I've sort of alluded to before, there's no single lawful basis that is better or more lawful than any of the others. It's just up to the controller to choose which one is the most appropriate for what they're doing with the data. And then just a quick note as well, if you're processing any special category, so sensitive data, you would also need what we call an additional condition for processing. Now, we think that for what you guys do, it's very unlikely that you're going to be processing special category information, but if you do, you can always contact us for advice and we can sort of talk you through that and direct you to the information on the website as well. Okay, so next up we've got data sharing. So it's really important to remember that data protection isn't a barrier to responsible data sharing. It's there to help guide organisations to share in the correct way. So in today's world, it's very common for data controllers to share data between them, and we quite often hear of organisations thinking that they can't share data because of the GDPR, but this often isn't the case. So when we're talking about sharing data between organisations, the controller decides whether to share the data, and they must do it in the right way. So as I've said before, you don't always have to have consent to share, but you must have a lawful basis. People, again, often think that consent is the only way to make sharing okay, but you can use whichever lawful basis is appropriate. If you do any regular sharing, it should be included in your privacy notice. And you should always have, you should have a a data sharing agreement. And we recommend that you have one of those for any regular processing that you do or regular sharing that you do. It makes it clear to both parties, the controller and the processor, so they know what the processes are and they know what to expect. You might come across some unexpected situations where you need to share data. There might be some exemptions that apply that allow you to do that, but you must always be able to justify and record your decision if you're doing any sort of unexpected sharing. Next, we've got the retention of data. So in data protection law, there's no set retention periods. So for most of the time, it is up to you to decide how long you keep data. But going back to those principles, you should only keep it for as long as is necessary for your purpose. So you shouldn't be keeping any data just in case it might be helpful in future. There are, however, some retention periods that are set by other laws, and you should follow these where they apply. So, for example, employers are expected to keep payroll records for at least 3 years after the end of the tax year that they relate to, and that would be where there is a retention period set in law. You must document your retention period, and this can go into your privacy policy that I spoke briefly about earlier. You should also regularly review what you hold. So you might have originally decided to keep certain records for a year, but actually when you review it, you might only need to keep them for 6 months. And so if that's the case, then obviously you can change your retention period. The more data that you keep, the greater the risk of a breach of the principles. And it also means that if there's a lot more information if you receive something like a subject access request, so you'd have to disclose that, and Rob will explain what that is in a minute. But hopefully that's given you an insight into some of the key terms and principles of data protection. And now I'm going to pass over to Rob, and he's going to start off by explaining about individuals' rights.
Thanks, Jessy. And just when you thought you'd had enough about data protection, I'm going to talk to you about some more now. And my voice is probably not as nice as Jessy, so I do apologise. Okay, so individuals' rights. So Jessy spoke about the principles that data protection law is based on. And on the other side of the coin, as it were, we've got individual rights. So the principles really put obligations on data controllers on how they use data. And then the legislation also gives rights to individuals, which are these individuals' rights. And they're obviously important as they give, as I say, fundamental rights to individuals in regards to their personal data and how and some control over it, even when it's used by a data controller. So the most commonly known of these rights is probably the right of subject access. SAR, as we call it. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more at the end of this section, because it's probably, as I say, the most common and the one that you'll have come across most. So so it's probably best to give that a bit of its own section. So I'll just briefly outline the other rights for now. So firstly, starting with the right to erasure. This is sometimes called the right to be forgotten. And you may have also heard about this one from some of the media stories over the years. It essentially allows people to request deletion of their data in certain circumstances. So a practical example might be, say, an individual asks a social media company to delete their old account and all the associated data. Then we have the right to restrict processing. So individuals can ask data controllers to limit how their data is used. So with this right, perhaps someone has disputed the accuracy of a medical record, and in the meantime, ask the hospital to stop using that information for treatment decisions until that data is corrected. So they would restrict the processing in that interim time. Then we have the right to object. So this gives individuals the ability to stop data controllers doing certain types of processing on their data. A right to be informed. This is one of the core ideas in data protection law and goes back to the principles and what Jessy mentioned previously about transparency. It's kind of the other side of the coin of that, really. So it ensures that transparency by requiring data controllers to tell individuals how their personal data is being used. So organizations must inform you if they're using your personal data and all those bits that Jessy talked about before in terms of transparency. Then we have the right to rectification. So if data is inaccurate as to a matter of fact, and that's quite important, it should be corrected. For example, maybe a customer notices you're using an old address and asks for it to be updated. It can get a bit complex, that situation, and that's why I mentioned about it being inaccurate as to a matter of fact. Sometimes we get asked questions about, oh, there was an email and a person said this about me. That's not true. So I want that email correcting. That wouldn't, the right to rectification wouldn't really work there, because in fact, it would be probably incorrect to do that, because that email is a matter of fact, that's what was written, that's what the person said. Whether the information that they've said is correct or not is a different matter. But we can discuss that later if anybody has any questions about that kind of situation. And then the right to data portability. This lets people move their data between services. It isn't one that we get a lot of questions about, really. I think when the GDPR was originally drawn up, I think the intention was probably to allow people to easily move big packets of data between organizations. So probably most likely, say, between utility companies, if you wanted to switch your gas or electric or something, it would be enable you to take that information and take it to another provider. But I think probably advances in technology and sort of easily accessible online accounts have probably made it a little redundant, really. We don't get a lot of questions about it, as I say, but it's still worth being aware of, although it probably, I don't know if it'll come up much in your line of work. Automated decision making. Conversely, compared to data portability, this is perhaps becoming a more prominent issue due to advances in technology, particularly with more and more organizations using AI to make decisions on their behalf. So basically, this right relates to automated decision making and profiling. And the aim really is to protect people from decisions made solely by algorithms without human involvement. So an example of that might be where a credit check on a prospective tenant is done entirely by automated means. They would have the right to ask for human intervention in that decision-making process. Okay, so like I said, we're going to move on to subject access, right of access. And as I say, this is probably the one you have all heard of or have had experience of. I think I was talking to Stuart at the beginning of this meeting about that. So right of access, or SAR as we call it. In our team, this is the topic that we get the most questions about from organisations by a long way, and always has been as long as I've been at the ICO. It's probably the most well-known of all the individual rights. It means that anyone can ask a data controller for a copy of their personal data at any time, and they can make that request verbally, in writing, or even over social media. So it's important that you were able to recognise when someone is making a subject access request. It's also important to stress that a subject access request is only for personal data. So as Jessy explained in her section, personal data is information about a specific living individual. And in general, people would make the request themselves, although they can allow a third party to make that request on their behalf. And if that happened, you just have to make sure that you did the right checks to make sure that they were acting on the behalf of the person. If a data controller receives a subject access request, in most circumstances, you've got 1 month to respond to it, and that period starts from the day the request is received. So it's important, as I say, that you recognise the subject access request if you get one and act on it as soon as possible. Otherwise, you could find yourself in difficulties. It can be extended by up to 2 further months if the request is complex or if multiple requests are received. And the individual must be informed if you're going to do that, if you're going to extend the time period within the first month, and told why the extension is necessary. Other important factors to mention are no fee can be charged for most subject access requests. For those of you that might remember the old legislation before GDPR, fees could be charged. I think it was £10 for normal data and £50 for medical data, but GDPR did away with any fees in normal circumstances. A controller can ask for proof of identity if necessary, but if you do, you need to be careful because, for example, there's no point in asking for photo ID if you haven't got a photo or you don't know what the person looks like that you're dealing with. There'd be no point asking for a photo. So only ask for data that you can verify. So again, if you haven't got someone's date of birth, there's no point in asking someone to provide the date of birth to you because you've got nothing to check it against anyway. So and also you mustn't use a request for ID to delay the response unnecessarily. You get quite a lot of questions about that, and our colleagues in the other department which deals with complaints from the public about where organisations haven't complied with data protection correctly, that's quite a common one there as well. So when providing information in response to a SAR, the personal data should be provided in what we call a commonly used electronic format, unless the individual requests otherwise. And typically, if, say, someone made a subject access request by email, you could respond to them by email as long as you make sure it was secure, depending on the sensitivity of the data and that kind of thing. But the best thing to do really with all aspects of subject access request is to speak to the requester if at all possible. If they've asked for lots of data or they've been really general in their request, just give them a call, speak to them and go, what, is there something specifically that you're after? Is there something that you want? And we found, from a practical point of view, dialogue, if at all possible, we realise that in some situations it might not be, but if at all possible, just dialogue and speaking to the individual is much better than struggling with a subject access request and then not getting it to them in the right time frame and that kind of thing. The last thing really to mention is there are some exemptions from the right of subject access, which I'm not going to go into in huge detail here, but it does mean that in certain circumstances, some information can be withheld if an exemption applies. So maybe a common one might come up in your line of work, legal professional privilege, for example. So if information is legally professionally privileged, advice, legal advice from a legal advisor like a solicitor or something, that might not need to be disclosed in a subject access request, or in certain cases, although it does get a little bit complex, sometimes where third-party data might be involved or intertwined with the data of the data subject. Okay, so moving on now, bit of a change of pace. So what is a personal data breach? So what do we mean by personal data breach? You probably have heard, it seems at the moment that a day doesn't go by without there being some news report about a big data breach or something like that, or someone's been fined for a data breach, or there's information being compromised in some way because of a breach. So a breach is any security incident that leads to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of or access to personal data. That wording is taken from the legislation. But in normal language, common examples would be things like you've sent an email to a tenant, but you've not disabled autofill in your email, and it's gone to, instead of going to Rob Cole, it's gone to Rob Smith or something like that. That's quite a common example, probably the one we hear about the most. There can be also unauthorized access to data, which might be, as a result of a phishing attack or something like that. Cyber attacks obviously are on the up and are more common now as well. And sort of ransomware attacks, that kind of thing, where they'll lock data until you've paid money to get access to that data. Or even losing data. So quite often we'll hear stories of someone's gone to a meeting and left their laptop, which isn't properly protected, and password protected, etc., on the train or something, and it might have personal data in it, or leaving documents on a train table or something like that. But even if you don't handle large amounts of data or particularly sensitive data, you still need to keep it safe, because even small breaches, like I say, about leaving some documents on a train table, can sometimes have serious consequences. There've been quite a lot of news stories lately where what seemed like a small breach has meant that people have had real issues in their life. We did a whole campaign, our colleagues in our public advice team, called the Ripple Effect, where it was examples of what, a school, for example, might release someone's data, but it turns out, that they are were in a domestically violent relationship for whatever. Now that person, that partner, ex-partner, has now got that data, so they've had to move house, that kind of thing. So you just have to be careful, because, as I say, even small breaches can sometimes have serious consequences. If a personal data breach occurs, there are certain rules laid down in the legislation. So data controllers must report certain breaches to us at the ICO within 72 hours of becoming aware of the breach, unless the breach is unlikely to result in a risk to individuals' rights and freedoms. And I'll go into that a little bit more in a second. If the breach is likely to result in a high risk to individuals, those affected must be informed without undue delay. And all breaches must be documented, regardless of whether they need to be reported to the ICO. So if you have a breach, even though it might not be result in a risk to the individual, you need to take a note of it and take certain steps, which I'll go into in a sec, as well. So you must assess the risk to individuals and take steps to mitigate harm if you need to. So, for example, if some of the data that was lost was, say, financial data, or perhaps identification data, which might be used and have a real effect on the person, you might have to do something to mitigate against that, or tell the individuals that they can take steps to mitigate against that. And all organizations should have procedures in place to detect, report, and investigate personal data breaches, really, just regardless of what size the organization is. So what to do if something does go wrong? And, data breaches are really common, especially, as I say, with emails and that kind of thing. So the first thing is don't panic. The worst thing you can do if you and we know from people that call us on our helpline from organizations, people losing sleep and, panicking and paying a fortune to IT companies to help them and things like that. Keep a calm head, don't panic to begin with, and then take certain steps. So depending on the type of organization, you'll probably need to let someone know that a breach has occurred. So in big organizations, for example, there should be a breach reporting process. We've got one at the ICO. Or in smaller organizations, maybe a chain of commands, so you tell your manager or something of that sort. You need to contain the incident. So, for example, if it was an email to an unintended recipient, if you can, ask them to delete that information, and for proof that they've deleted it, if at all possible, as well. And then that helps to mitigate against it. Assess the risk, think about the type and sensitivity of the data. So who is affected, what it is, why they would be affected, what the data is that's been breached, and what you can do to reduce any harm. And then once you've done all those things and the incident is contained and you've taken any mitigation steps, that kind of thing, then you can review what happened, identify the root cause, and make any improvements that you need to, so it's less likely to happen again in the future. So that might be, making sure you've got a more robust security system in your IT infrastructure, or, like I say, simple things like disabling the autofill in your emails, or having clear procedures, about what people should and shouldn't do with personal data. And then finally, remember, not every breach needs to be reported to us, only those likely to pose a high risk to an individual's rights and freedoms, but you need to document every breach and check to make sure, whether you do need to report it to us, what's the threshold, that kind of thing. Okie dokie. And then just a little bit on the obligation to register with the ICO. So most organisations that process personal data electronically must pay a data protection fee to the ICO unless they're exempt. That said, there are lots of exemptions, particularly that might apply to smaller businesses like yours. So things like accounts and records exemption, core business exemption, that kind of thing. So you might be exempt. It depends what you're doing with the data, and as I say, not every organisation will need to register. Some will, quite a lot of small organisations will be exempt. But the important thing to remember, and as people sometimes get confused about this, regardless of the requirement to register, that's a separate requirement really. All organisations still have to comply with the principles and all the bits we've talked about today. Whether you need to register or not, you still need to comply with the law in terms of how you use people's personal data. If you do need to pay a fee, it depends on the size and turnover. For most organisations in the UK, it's £52 a year, and that has to be paid every year. It's based on size and turnover and things, but as I say, for most types of organisation in the UK, it's £52 at the moment. And these that fee is what funds our work really. So that £52 from the organisations that need to pay it, that's what enables us to come and do these sort of talks and things like that. So that's why it's important to mention here. And then just very, very briefly, and hopefully we should have time for some questions. Two things to mention. I think Stuart asked us just to briefly mention these when he asked us to come and speak to you. Two pieces of legislation that have recently come into effect that may have some impact. So the Data Use and Access Act 2025, which focuses on improving transparency and accountability in how data is shared and accessed. It's the latest iteration. There's been things in the pipeline for a while to sort of update and change some little bits here and there of the GDPR, and this is the latest iteration that this government has managed to get through. It changes and adds, as I say, some bits to the existing data protection law. Not all of the GDPR, but some specific bits are changed or added to. I won't go into a huge detail unless anyone has any specific questions, partly because it's coming in a sort of phased approach. So some bits of the changes have already happened, some aren't happening until next year. So I'm not going to go into huge detail now, but just to be aware of that. And then the Renters' Rights Act, which you all probably know. I know Stuart does way more about than we do, but the reason we mention it is, as I understand it, it essentially strengthens protection for tenants, including how their personal data might be handled by landlords and letting agents, for example. So that could have some effect, and there are bits that we know about that might have some impact on how people handling their tenants' data might need to comply with data protection law in a slightly different way. But the general message is we'll keep monitoring both of those bits of legislation and any changes, and our website's getting updated quite regularly. So any updates that are necessary will be on our website. So that is it, I think. So brings us to questions. I answered a couple earlier, I think. Has there been any since, Jessy?
Yeah, so I've gone through and answered a couple more. So Eden asked a really good question, saying that they only have the emails with the names, email addresses, and occasionally telephone numbers, and they understand that they need to be compliant, but it seems like there's a lot of hoops to jump through. So is there sort of anything that we can sort of show them that is the minimum basic requirements, like a list of steps or forms, so that they can be compliant without making it a big faff? So I've just said about the privacy notice generator on our website is
Yeah.
a really good starting point. So you can literally go onto that generator, it asks you some sort of step-by-step questions, and then that generates your privacy notice for you. And that obviously for like a lot of smaller organizations, you're not necessarily going to have a lot of documentation because you're not going to be collecting huge amounts of data, you're not going to be processing vast amounts of personal data most likely. It's more about sort of taking that common sense approach and being sort of, compliant with the principles. I don't know if you've got anything you want to add to that, Rob?
No, I think that's fine. I just noticed, I think, question from Rowley. I think that might have been nice said about if you delete it and ask for proof that someone's deleted it. And you're right. I don't think you probably can prove that other than saying I've deleted it. So that's fine. Is there any questions that we haven't answered? Anybody want to ask a question in person at all, or?
Yeah, please do ask away, guys. I have got a question though about my
Mhm.
back of Word documents, which I
Oh, yeah.
touched on earlier. So in my business, we use Inventory Base, and what I'd say to everyone listening is, if you use software, what you'll find is a lot of it's got auto delete on personal data. So you can tick a little box, and what happens is when the tenancy's over, it deletes the tenant's information, which is a really handy piece of information, really handy tool. But we've got, at the last count, I think about 20,000 Word documents saved on our Google Drive, which is as secure as Google gets, I imagine. But one of the things that I was concerned about is what happens if we get a subject access request and I've got 20,000 Word documents to look through.
Yeah, I think we did discuss this briefly earlier, didn't we? So there's a few things to point out. One is before you kind of get to the situation where you've got a subject access request, and I think you mentioned it in that handy automated deletion aspect in some software. I think Jessy talked about the retention principle and not keeping information for longer than is necessary. So one good sort of tip really is, if you can, try not to get to a situation when you've got 20,000 documents that you might need to look through should you get a subject access request. So make sure you're doing regular deletion as appropriate. If you don't need to keep data, there might be other law, as Jessy touched on, that says you need to keep certain data for certain amounts of time. If there isn't, ascertain your own sort of retention period, how long you'll need to keep that data to do what you need to do with it. And if you don't need to keep it, then make sure you have a deletion policy in place to get rid of that information after a certain time. The other aspect to mention in terms of subject access requests is, I think I did touch on it briefly, but just in a bit more detail, what an individual is entitled to and make a subject access request is their personal data, not necessarily whole discrete documents. So there may be documents, for example, which might have some of their personal data in it, but they wouldn't be entitled to all the rest of the documents. Whether that makes life easier or harder, it's difficult to say, but they're only entitled to their own personal data, not whole documents necessarily. And the other thing to mention is, say, for example, if in all those documents you had, Stuart, the only personal data about the person you have is their name, but their name appears in 20,000 separate documents, you wouldn't have to supply their name to them 20,000 times. It would be enough to say, some of the personal data that we process is your name, this is it. and you wouldn't have to sort of extract that from every single document, unless, of course, there was other information with it that was their personal data or had some sort of context in place or something like that. So I think that's covered that. Any other questions or anything else in the chat?
Yeah, so Paul's asked a question around the fee, saying that if the data we store is landlords and agents' contact details plus other personal details regarding tenants given to us by landlords and agents, would we need to register and pay the fee?
Oh, that's a good question. I think what I would suggest, Paul, is to either ring our colleagues in our registration department or have a look, use out on our website. We've got a really handy tool that you can go through to see whether you're likely to need to pay or not, ask you a number of questions. So that's probably the best thing to do in that situation, I would suggest.
And because it will actually depend, as well as the information that you're processing, it sort of depends on what you're doing with that information as well. So it will slightly depend on what you are actually doing with those details and how you're using them.
Yeah, one thing to mention just on registration, slightly going off on a tangent, but if you have premises, for example, so even if you are exempt from having to register because of the core business exemption or council and records exemption or something like that, if you have a premises and you had CCTV on that premises, basically you'll have to register because of the CCTV. CCTV essentially means that you need to register regardless of, your other business or whatever. If you've got CCTV on your premises, you'd need to register for the CCTV, essentially.
And then Angela's asked a really good question, which I'll answer as well as reading it out. So it's what is the recommended method of disposing of old printed copies of inventories? So if it's got any personal data on it and it's printed copy, the best thing to do is probably to shred it. Or if you are like a company that has like confidential waste bins and things like that, it's basically making it so that it can't be accessed by other people. So shredding is always a good one.
Yeah, the legislation doesn't, it's a bit like retention. It doesn't go into specifics. It leaves that a lot to the data controller. But like Jessy said, just ensure that it's disposed of in the most appropriate way. Over the years, we have had stories of people dumping stuff in bins in parks and stuff. And not only is that going to get you on our radar, it's probably, if your customers hear about it, it's probably not going to do much for your business reputation either. So this use sort of common sense and destroy it, get rid of it in ways like Jessy says that it's not going to come back to haunt you. Don't just chuck it in the tip, probably.
Yeah, it's a good point. I've got a cheap shredder which I use, but then, having said that, I suppose the only bits that you need to shred are probably the address and the signature page, their names on it, and then everything else is unidentifiable because
that's a good point.
Picture of a random kitchen, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, it would only be the personal data really that you'd need to have concerns about. Yeah, Shredder can't cope with the amount of reports. Yeah, I must admit, I'm obsessed with shredding, but I got a shredder and it doesn't cope very well at all with all the bits and bobs. So burning them's fine. Maybe, make sure if you do it on a public bonfire or something, just make sure that it does light properly.
That's brilliant. Okay, well, we're getting towards the end of the webinar, so thank you very much for your help, Jessy and Rob, on this. That's been very interesting, actually. I'd like to think I know a fair bit about data protection, and I've learned something today. I've learned several things today, actually. So I'll be having a little look at my policies, and I'm going to go and regenerate my privacy policy using your tool, because I do love a free tool.
Yeah, and if you when you do that, if you have any feedback, I think there's still a mechanism to give us feedback on it as well. So if you have any feedback on it, then do let us know, because we're trying to improve it. Most of the tools that we've got, we're trying to improve as we go along. So any feedback is really, really useful.
All right, brilliant.
Also, just following on from that as well, if there is anything that we've missed, anybody's got any questions that they think of after this, you can always give the helpline a ring as well.
Oh yeah, plug the helpline, Jessy. We've got a slide for that.
We haven't actually. Oh, actually, I've got the
missed the trick.
number
Yeah,
there you go. So there's the number there at the bottom. I'll give everybody a second to make a note of it.
yeah,
But
it's
definitely make use
that's
of
what we
us.
work on, isn't it, Jesse? That's so it's open Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. We have a live chat facility as well. Helpline's better though if it's a bit more of a complex issue, because obviously live chats you're a bit hampered by having to type the answers out and stuff. It's much better to discuss it. But yeah, yeah, please do call our colleagues if you need any advice.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And I have put the link there for the ICO's data fee self-assessment tool.
Oh, that's it. Yeah.
Do click on there and have a little check on that and find out if you need to pay a fee and what that is. £52 sounds like a lot when you say it quickly, but it's £1 a week. So it's, you know.
I'll use that as a marketing strategy next time we mention it.
Please do. Marketing from an accountant there. So enjoy that, Rob. Right. Okay. So let me just see if I can't share my window. There we go. Okay, so just a signpost to a few upcoming events. We are coming towards the end of the year, so the timings and dates are a little bit variable here because we're all busy people, obviously. We're about to do a December board roundtable, which is an absolutely brand new event for us. So that's a few members of the board sitting around having a chat about how the year's gone, what things we see in the market, in the industry, and what things we're going to be doing in the future. It's a brand new test. We'll be doing it live. We'll also be putting, again, a video on our YouTube channel, so you can look at that at a later date. And really, it's a test to see if that's helpful for members in terms of communication. 7th of January, again, another thing that we're going to be testing is an MTD video, so making tax digital. If you're not aware of this, all businesses are going to be subject to making tax digital at various points. At the moment, all businesses with a turnover of 50,000 plus will be required to comply next year. So I'll be putting out a video which just goes through a few of the points that you need to bear in mind for that, and that'll be in week 1 in January. We've also agreed with the Corgi training section. They're going to do a webinar on damp and the causes of damp, because I think one of the things that I think a lot of us have got is we've got a bit of knowledge about damp. A lot of it has come from almost the guy down the pub kind of thing, and we've accepted it as truth. Well, these guys really do know the truth, so it's quite useful and handy to get it from the horse's mouth, and I think that adds real value for our agents when we do work for them. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for turning up. It's really, really good of you. Please do let us know if there's anything that you would like us to cover in the future, because we're always looking for ideas. And if there's some burning topics that we are not aware of, do let us know. Do look out for the recording. We'll send you out an email later on, and there'll be a download. If there's any downloads that we want to send out, there'll be links there for you. Yeah, please do look out for emails on upcoming events. So without further ado, I will call the meeting to a close. So thank you, everyone. And once again, thank you, Jessy and Rob, for your help. It's been really, really valuable.